the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. We also have the chance today to have Professor James Galbraith, who is a professor at the London Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin, and who woke up very early this morning to join us. And we have also the chance to have Jomo, who is currently a senior economic advisor of the government of Malaysia, and who has served during many years as a UN Assistant Secretary General, also serving at UNDSA. So thanks a lot for the three of you. You will be given a few minutes to introduce the discussion, and then we will have an interactive discussion. Before we start, and before I give the floor to Professor Popov, my colleague Rebecca Creamer, who has been really instrumental with her team in putting together this first seminar, will give you instruction and the way we can make this discussion extremely interactive and how to, in a way, participate in the discussion. So she will give very important instruction, and then we will start the discussion. Thank you.
Unmute yourself, Rebecca.
Thank you, James. So yes, I'm Rebecca. I'm the event manager here at DOC. As Jean-Christophe said, this is our first webinar. We are going to try and keep technical difficulties to an absolute minimum, but please bear with us if they do happen. So dialogue is what our organisation is all about. So we are going to offer you two ways in which you can ask a question to our expert speakers today. One option will be to type it in the chat function. This will enable Jean-Christophe, the moderator, to see your question and read it out for you. If you do choose to use this option, then please write your name and affiliation so that we know who you are. Alternatively, if you would like to ask your question verbally, then please use the raise your hand button. Again, this will alert the moderator that you are keen to ask a question. And if Jean-Christophe approaches you, then I will unmute your microphone so that you will be able to ask your question. It will be heard by everybody in the webinar. That may take a couple of seconds, so please bear with us before you start speaking. Also, again, please do introduce yourself and your affiliation, and try and keep questions to a minimum of, to a maximum of 30 seconds. Also, just to let you all know, the webinar is being recorded. It's also being streamed live on Facebook right now. And once it's over, we will make a recording available on the DOC website, which is doc-research.org, and also on our YouTube channel. So I hope you enjoy it, and back to Jean-Christophe.
Thank you, Rebecca. Before the discussion starts, I will ask you to say again, what are the housekeeping and instruction when it comes to organize the interactive discussion. But without waiting any further, I would now turn to my colleague, Professor Popov, to introduce the discussion. He has been assigned about 6 minutes, and I know he's very good with sticking his the time to introduce the discussion.
Sorry for being delayed. I had to switch to another computer. I'm sorry. Sometimes it is beyond my competence. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome also to Dr. Yakunin, who is the chairman of the Dialogue of Civilization Institute, and we will speak at the end to give closing remarks. So we have now Professor Popov.
Yes, thank you so much, Jean-Christophe. I would like to welcome everyone who joins the discussion today, and thank you so much for joining the discussion. I hope we will have some interesting issues to discuss and the provocative statements that I'm going to suggest to discuss. Since I'm the first speaker, I prepared a PowerPoint presentation, and I'd like to show you. I hope you can see it now. If you cannot see, please let me know. I hope you can see now the plan of the issues that are supposed to be discussed. So here are 3 issues. The first one is the issue of the recession. I think by this time we realize that the world is already in the recession. And I think by this time we also realize that this recession is the deepest in the post-war period. The question is how we deal with this recession, and I'll try to offer some provocative statements on the issue. The second issue is, what do we do after the recession? It appears that some economic systems, some countries, and some regions of the world were far more successful, not only in dealing with coronavirus pandemic, but also in dealing with the recession. And so there would be a discussion, I think, for the next many years to come, which model is more competitive, East Asian model or the Western model. And the third one is the issue of globalization. Is it going to be interrupted, or is it going to be reversed, or is it going to continue after a short interruption? So let me first describe some issues with respect to the recession. I hope you can see the chart now. This is the growth rates of US GDP in post-war period. Well, since 1961 to be more precise. You can see that the reduction of output in post-war recessions in the United States and in most advanced countries as well was actually very small. It was something like 1 to 2% only. And even in 2009, when we had something which we call the Great Recession, the reduction of output in the United States was only 2.4%, minus 2.4%. This time we're talking about the reduction of about 10% and maybe more than 10%. This is comparable with the Great Depression. If you look at this chart, this is the GDP per capita, growth rates of GDP per capita in the United States. This is the logarithmic scale, so this is really the straight line. And the only deviation, significant deviation from this line was in the period of 1930s, in the Great Depression of 1929, 1932. And today we're facing the event of the same magnitude. Unemployment in the post-war period, unemployment rate in the United States was never higher than 10%. In 2009, 2010, it was about 10%. And in 1982, 83, it was about 10%. In the Great Depression, it was over 20%. And today, we are talking about the unemployment rate of 10, 15%, and maybe even more. So this is going to be an exceptional event in the history of Western countries, the history of the whole world, in the economic history of the whole world. And this is not the issue for the discussion, but the issue is how you deal with the recession. Most countries have already adopted traditional Keynesian stimuli, but the understanding today is that this stimuli may not be enough. What is the traditional Keynesian policy? It's the increase in government spending, the reduction of government taxes, and the increase in the money supply. It is supposed to produce a higher demand. For instance, the higher demand for the ventilators that are now in short supply. This is supposed to lead to the increase in price of the ventilators and the increase in production. This is a chain that first doesn't really work that well. And second, maybe it is not fair because once the prices for ventilators increase, they say, oh, the producers of the ventilators are making windfall profits on the disasters of the others and so on. But it's important to understand in the market economy, if there is no increase in price, there is no increase in production because entrepreneurs will not introduce the second shift and the third shift if there is no increase in profitability because the costs increase. And they will not, of course, make investment to increase the production because in the uncertain times, you face a lot of risk. You don't want to increase, you don't want to put the money into the construction of the new plants and new production lines unless you know that the profitability is really high. So my argument is that policies to encourage the reallocation of resources, to eliminate the bottlenecks. The bottlenecks today are in the production of medical supplies, in the healthcare services, in the production of public safety. So if there is no particular policies like the organization of public works to encourage the reallocation of resources, then countries will not be very successful in dealing with the recession. There may be programs of public works that were used in 1930s. There may be the experience of the conversion of non-defense industries to the defense industries during the war. But this is something that is necessary to eliminate the situation when you have unemployment on the one hand and the shortage of basic medical supplies on the other hand. This is unnatural, irrational, and countries that are going to deal with this better than the others will probably get a lot of praise. Now, the second issue to be discussed is the issue of East Asian model versus the Western model. It seems like the East Asian model today is more successful in dealing not only with the coronavirus itself, but also with the recession. East Asian model knows how to reallocate resources from one place to another, how to convert the auto plants into the production of ventilators. And I think the East Asian model, it is of course debated, but people say that East Asian model has greater social solidarity. It has lower inequalities. Normally, you look at the Gini coefficient. In China, Gini coefficient is pretty high, but if you control for the size of the country, you can see that Gini coefficient is high in China because of the differences between the provinces. The provinces have very uneven level of development. If this differences between the provinces in income is eliminated, the income inequality in China would be very low for the country of its territory and for the country of its size. So this is one item which makes Asian model different. This is the priority of collectivist interests over the individual interests. And the second item, in Asia, somehow it's easily acceptable when you need the greater involvement of the state. You're not afraid that personal freedoms would be violated if the private sector is not doing something which needs to be done. In East Asia, there is an understanding that the government should step in and do it. And the third issue to be discussed is the globalization issue. Now, we have the world which is very much divided. We have sanctions which are imposed against countries like Iran and Russia and other countries. In the European Union, there are countries that are introduced the borders, once again, in the Schengen zone. And the trade flows and capital flows and people's movement now is in jeopardy. So the question is, are we going to see the retreat in globalization? Are we going to return to the economies of nation state, to the self-sufficiency instead of international trade? If you look at the ratio of trade, international trade to GDP for the period of recent 200 years, you may see that it was growing all the time from 5% in the beginning of the 19th century, 200 years ago, to about 25% today. Yes, there were periods of decline, like during the wars, of course, and during the recessions, Great Recession and the period of the Second World War, there was a decline, but then the trend was to increase. And the same goes for the stock of direct investment. This is the stock of direct investment in the long run. In 1913, the total stock of direct investment was only 10% of GDP, of the world GDP. And today, it is over 30% of GDP. And basically the same goes for the movement of people. These are the data for the United States, but for the other countries, the data are pretty much the same. The share of people who are foreign born and who live in a different country because they're foreign born increases. Yes, there were times when in the United States, for instance, during the mass immigration in the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, these numbers were higher. But basically today they are at the same level. And even in countries like China, the percentage of foreign born is very low. Now it is only 1 million people. This is the estimate of the foreign born out of 1,400 million people. But it grows very rapidly. So I would say that countries that are going to win in future are going to be countries that will not interrupt globalization, but will find the way to proceed with the globalization with a human face. What does this mean? The problem is that if you stop the movement of goods, capital, and labor in the international economy, your productivity declines. The way to increase productivity overall, over all the known human history, was to specialize and to proceed with the international division of labor. So countries that will go to self-sufficiency, of course, will lose in living standards and in productivity. We can go to medieval times, to the feudal estates, where everything except for salt and spices was produced inside the estate, but then the productivity would be low. So we need to find a way to increase productivity to proceed with globalization, but to proceed with such globalization, which is not going to produce income inequalities, which is going to be consistent with the green economy and not going to lead to the increase in emissions of SO2 and CO2. And I think this is possible. Let me limit myself to this preliminary offers for the discussion, and I'm sure that other experts will have a lot to say and to argue with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vladimir, for this wonderful introduction and setting the stage. And it is clear that we are not wondering ourselves if we are entering in a recession. This is, we all know that. The question indeed is how to handle this recession, how to really to mitigate most of the risk, and also this question, which evidently would be of great interest for discussion with our next two guests, whether there is a successful economic model in handling the economic crisis and a model that doesn't work well. So the Asian versus the Western way of handling the crisis. This is something that we would certainly be interested to hear from Professor Galbraith and from Jomo. And also, and in a way, this will be a very important point, is how this will really impact the shape of the globalization, trade, models of production, and so on and so forth. So I'm immediately giving the floor to Professor Galbraith, who will give us his perspective, and again, thanking him for being early, very early with us.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And I will address 3 points very briefly, and this is the only slide that I'll put up just to summarize and keep myself on track. First question is what happened and what happened specifically in the United States. And it seems to me a fair summary is that a country which is specialized, had the strongest sectors in, for example, finance and in the high technology sectors, information technology and aerospace, and which had pursued internally a politics of open trade and globalization, of market-driven, capital market-driven inequalities and income distribution, of progressively smaller government, decentralization, and periodic bouts of austerity, particularly in the provision of public services, along with a federal government which had come to be largely dominated by the interests of lobbying groups. I think that's a fair statement, and one that applies to both parties. This country found itself, having done this over 40 years, in a position, in a situation where the absolute opposite qualities were what was required, specifically solidarity, compact and complete supply chains in a number of basic goods and services, stronger public services, social organization, and a national leadership with a very strong public purpose. Those qualities are not entirely lacking. They have emerged in the course of the crisis, and they may still be in the process of getting organized, especially in many cases at the level of the states or the localities, but they are impaired. They're unquestionably impaired. They're impaired in terms of the number of hospital beds per capita that are available, in terms of the production capacities for medical protective equipment and for things like ventilators, in terms of the responsiveness of the population to the calls for social organization, in terms of the capacity of the national leadership to send clear, coherent, and effective messages. So in the short term, there are a number of challenges which have been especially severe in the United States and were better handled certainly better handled in both China and Korea. And maybe, well, I think Europe is an intermediate case where some of these challenges are also very severe due to a similar pattern of decentralization and austerity over the years. But the challenges are basically 3. The first is to provide and maintain a sufficient supply of medical services and supplies, including the protection of the medical staff, including hospital beds, ICU units, and the personal protective equipment. That is, at the moment, highly stressed and barely hanging on, but still largely hanging on in most of the country. The second thing is to is to mobilize the population, to get the population to do what it has to do in order to break the chain of transmission of the virus. And that is, in most cases, simply to stay at home and to practice social distancing and to basically put all other economic activity into abeyance. And that's the reason why the economic statistics look so bad, is that people are in fact complying. Businesses have shut down and people are staying at home, and travel is greatly curtailed. All the things that normally contribute to economic numbers and employment numbers have been stopped for the time being, as they must be for public health reasons. So there is both the statistics that Vladimir Popov was discussing are an artifact of the response to the pandemic. They're not inherent in some, they're not somehow separated from it or to be dealt with as separate phenomenon, obviously. And the third major challenge is to maintain the supplies that are essential to keep the population in place. Basically a problem of civilian supply, a problem of prices, a problem of assuring that groceries and basic medicines and other things that are required to keep utilities and public safety that are required to keep the population stable and safe in their houses, in their apartments and so forth, that these services continue to flow through the crisis so that we can get through the other side without having a breakdown of the social order. And there we are also seeing, although in many cases the supply chains are hanging on, we're seeing areas of great stress. In particular, for example, at the bottom of the food chain, where people who have been relying on food banks, the supplies for those banks have dried up because stores no longer have inventory that can spare. They've basically been cleaned out, and the demand is way up. And at the same time, the volunteers who run those operations are generally elderly, and they aren't coming out. So we have a serious collapse and a problem of let's say for a part of the population that's deeply dispossessed. The response to the challenge so far has been, I think, of mixed quality, largely driven by past experience in economic recessions and treating this as a essentially Keynesian phenomenon requiring something called stimulus, which it seems to me is an inappropriate way of thinking about it. This is much more of a wartime phenomenon. It requires mobilization, it requires reorganization, it requires effective control of things that need to be provided, and effective suspension of activities that can be suspended, which is exactly the transformation problem that you face when you've got, when you've got an external threat that we faced in the Second World War, for example. So thinking about it in those terms, the fact that people are unemployed, well, that just means that they need to be supported to get through this thing, and then somehow we have to figure out what happens on the other side. And that's the third part of my very brief presentation, is what are the longer term challenges. And I think there are three that come to mind as being very important at the moment, that will clearly become important as the initial wave of the pandemic passes and the issues I've just described are either dealt with, or, well, one hopes that they're dealt with, because the consequences of not dealing with them would be very severe. And the first of these issues is that with a great many people out of work and with the support for their incomes very problematic in some cases, we have a program, for example, sending cash tax rebates to people, which in many cases is a very small sum, and in many cases will not reach people for weeks and weeks. Many cases won't reach them at all because they didn't file taxes in the appropriate period. You're going to have a pileup of debts. You're going to have a pileup of rents and mortgage debts and utility debts and all kinds of unpaid bills. And those debts are essentially like wartime debts. They're not debts that can justifiably be called in when this is over, because the people obviously have no responsibility for the conditions that put them in a situation where their fixed obligations are greatly exceed their incoming incomes. That's going to have to be resolved. It can't be resolved the way it was the last time, by waves of foreclosures and evictions and repossessions and so forth. After the great financial crisis, that would be totally socially unacceptable and would lead, I think, to a major political crisis in the country. The second thing is that it's clear that the health sector, as it has been organized, which is was very adapted, if you like, to the income structure and to the structure of morbidities and so forth that we had, is not adequate to deal with a general public health threat and has to be reorganized. The health insurance sector is clearly melting down under the pressure as we speak. And of course, the inadequate provision of beds in ICU facilities, and inability to allocate medical supplies in a coherent way requires a permanent central organization and a central payments mechanism that's going to be, and a much larger investment in things that are clearly much easier to do, and they have much easier for China to do, to monitor public health and to assess people's conditions so that the rest of life can begin to normalize. And that's going to require having people doing those jobs and having people employed to do it. So that's the second big thing. And the third thing one has to recognize is that life going forward isn't going to be like the life that we experienced 6 weeks ago. It's just not going to be the same. You can pick out anything you care to examine, but an easy case is, for example, the airlines. If the airlines have to practice social distancing, that is a great reduction of their capacity without any reduction of the cost of flying. So that you're going to see those, whether the economic model that they've pursued over these years of packing people into planes and flying great numbers of them around the world, whether it works. And you'll have to ask whether people will have the resources to do that, and whether they have the will. Will they be willing to get on to airplanes to go to destinations where they are not necessarily covered by a healthcare system or familiar with how it works? I think you're going to see a great reduction in demand for those services. And going forward, that's going to be true of many other industries. The restaurant sector is much bigger than the airline sector. Restaurants have to practice social distancing. Their capacity is going to be considerably less. They're going to have to reorganize their business if they're going to be able to stay in business at all. So personal services is another thing. Anything that requires personal contact is going to have protections built in so that people feel safe, for example, to go to a hairdresser or to go to any kind of activity that involves direct personal contact, to go to a gym. So we're looking at a massive reorganization. I would regard relocalization of much of the life that we have, and that will in some ways be, and it will be a very interesting phenomenon. Whether we can organize it successfully will be a real test of the adaptability of society, and not just here. This is going to be true all over the world, except where society is already organized substantially on those principles. And I'll make one final point, which addresses Vladimir Popov's question about the East-West model. I do not believe this is a question of culture, because I would point out that the Asian model that you're describing was very much itself a derivative in many ways of what was a very successful model in the United States and in Europe in the post-war period. In the United States, beginning in the New Deal and going through the Second World War and into the 50s and 60s. In the post-war period, models that were adapted to Japan, to post-war Germany, and ultimately also in many respects by the People's Republic of China, came out of the experience of the Western countries, and especially of the US in the war and the post-war period. These are built around corporate organizations that do a great deal of the economic activity, that are run as going concerns, that have a strong sense of a broader purpose, that are not run the way Anglo-American corporations have been run for the last 40 years, with a total obsession with shareholder value and short-term profits and long supply chains and all of that, but rather have a strong element of public purpose. And this is a highly familiar topic to me, since it was the life theme of the work of a certain economist I happen to know very well, a guy by the name of John Kenneth Galbraith. And his influence was clearly present in the development of, let's say, the post-war Asian economies, Japan, Korea, and also in the development of China, as I discovered when I was an advisor there in the 1990s. So it seems to me that there are models here which have historical roots in countries which have neglected them. And the task for us is to understand how we can draw on our own history as well as on the successful experience that we've just seen in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for addressing those issues of short-term and longer-term perspective and challenges for the U.S. economy, and also introducing about this question: why is it actually that the U.S. economy was not prepared, to handle such a crisis? This is something that we can get back later on. I would like immediately now to turn to Jomo, but before doing so, just reminding what Rebecca told us, that you can start sending questions through the chat. I have already received a few. You can also later on, when we will open the discussion, be in a position to ask your question live, but don't hesitate to send through the chat. I think this is probably easier to manage. But I'm giving immediately the floor now to Jomo, who in a way will respond by way or another to what Vladimir has introduced, this sort of dilemma or different ways to handle the crisis from a Western and Asian perspective. I think there's also one very important element that we have not really discussed so far, which is the role of the state. We've seen, and I think it will be important to get back to this point with James, those tremendous and staggering stimulus that were decided in the United States with this $2 trillion and the same on the EU side. I would be interested to hear also from the three of you how those tremendous inflows of money will contribute to mitigate the risk of a crash of the world economy, or if there are different ways to look at those issues. Jomo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe, and congratulations to the Institute for organizing this event. And I hope that this will generate the kind of interest which is urgently demanded by the challenging times in which we live. Let me first emphasize that there are very important novel aspects of the crisis which we face today. It is not just an economic crisis for obvious reasons, but there are very important consequences of the very specific character of the viral pandemic. This has forced upon us a fundamental change in the way we live, in our social and economic interactions. And this has a very profound influence, requiring, for example, physical distancing and other types of precautionary measures. As far as the economic impact is concerned, I think what needs to be emphasized is that we have what the Americans might call a double whammy in the form of a supply shock, a huge supply shock. But it's not just a one-term shock, but something which will have long-term consequences in terms of our future ability to continue to produce goods and especially to deliver services. This will be extremely important for a long time to come, certainly until such time that a vaccine is available for all people. In addition, the supply shocks also imply, for example, a significant reduction of income, particularly for those who do not have fixed incomes or guaranteed incomes due to formal employment guarantees and so on and so forth. And this will have a tremendous impact in terms of the way in which we spend. And this has exacerbated what can be called the demand side shock. And more importantly, in terms of looking beyond the immediate responses to efforts to try to contain the crisis, what we see is that there is unlikely to be any more return to business as usual. That is simply not a viable scenario for all kinds of reasons. In fact, it is very likely that the physical distancing which is being required in the short term will fundamentally change the way in which we interact both at the interpersonal level, at the workplace, in communities, and beyond that internationally as well. And all this will basically mean many things, but what we are beginning to think about are new normals. I don't want to talk about a new normal because what it means in terms of the profound changes in life will be quite different in different parts of the United States. It'll be quite different in different parts of Asia and the rest of the world. One of the important consequences and part of the reason why we have such a serious crisis, and this I think is part of the big difference between East Asia, if you will, and I don't like to generalize about the West, but particularly the Anglo-American West, because that is where the delay in action was greatest. In East Asia, there was generally early action. As soon as the virus was identified as posing new challenges, most of the East Asian countries which have responded very well immediately acted and took a number of precautionary measures which we don't have time to get into right now. Even in China, it is often generalized, the Wuhan experience, and Wuhan and perhaps the three provinces involved, which were the epicenter of the epidemic in China. The response there was far more restrictive, if you will, than in the rest of China. In Guangdong, for example, which is the second highest population which has actually been tested, second only to the Republic of Korea or South Korea. We see a very high level of testing, but there was relatively less in terms of a lockdown. So even to generalize in terms of China and to generalize too much from the Wuhan lockdown, I think has affected our ways of thinking. Now, if we look at the most influential Western study, and it's been very important in terms of changing the policy in the United Kingdom, the Imperial College of London study basically does not consider economic dimensions of the crisis, either the costs or some of the other consequences. And therefore, I think it focuses very much on different ways of eliminating. And I think what we are grateful to the Imperial College study for is enforcing the United Kingdom government to change from its previous approach of trying to develop so-called herd immunity if the virus were to spread throughout the population, and to adopt a much stronger approach. This stronger approach, because it was delayed so much, has taken the form of a lockdown. But we have to recognize that in much of East Asia, even in China itself, the lockdown was exceptional. After the Chinese New Year, the Lunar New Year holidays, people went back to work, and there have, of course, been restrictions. Now, movements out of Wuhan city, for example, are no longer being restricted. So I think it is very, very important to not generalize too much from specific actions. So the real choice was whether you had early action or you had delayed responses. And the delayed response typically has involved lockdowns. So the difference is not just between East Asia. I would like to draw your attention, for example, to a very poor state in southwestern India, the state of Kerala, where for various reasons, there was a strong and early response in the month of January itself, where the chief minister and the health minister took a very, very proactive approach. And that has basically made this relatively poor state with very, very minimal resources, because it has been discriminated against by the center as well. It has been able to limit the spread of the virus quite successfully, not only in terms of the number of people who are infected, but also it has been very, very exemplary, in my view, in terms of looking at the consequences of physical movement restrictions, particularly on the most vulnerable in society. And we are talking about an agricultural state where in the urban areas, there are workers, many of whom are daily rated, daily paid, and very, very subject to such vulnerabilities. And also, of course, we have the problems of people who are self-employed and often heavily dependent on daily turnover of whatever business services, they might be involved in. I think yet another issue is in the Kerala experience has been how, like in the rest of East Asia, there has been an all-of-government approach. In all too many countries in the developing world especially, we have seen a major focus on the role of public health and the role of the police. Whereas in the case of Korea and as well as other countries, You have seen the transport ministry heavily involved, the education ministry heavily involved, and a number of other ministries very, very heavily involved. And all of government approach completely informing, keeping the public fully informed. Because if the government doesn't have credibility, people will not comply. If the government does not educate, and this is especially challenging in an age of fake news, in an age where everybody thinks they're an expert by picking up a couple of articles on the internet and so on and so forth. So we have tremendous problems. But what we have seen in the case of a very poor state like Kerala, and this I think is extremely important, because if we are going to influence the responses of people in sub-Saharan Africa and other relatively poorer countries in order for them to be less vulnerable, this requires not only early action, but also action which is as equitable as can be in these very, very difficult circumstances. So let me emphasize that this all-of-government approach in turn is to engender an all-of-society or whole-of-society approach, and basically with a heavy emphasis on protecting the most vulnerable in society, so that we come through this period together with greater social solidarity and so on and so forth. I'm less concerned about the reductions in GDP growth and so on and so forth. The fact that, for example, many of us do not go out to eat as much as we might have in the past, and so on and so forth, will affect the contribution of the restaurant business to GDP. The fact that there is a significantly less travel, air travel is going to affect normal measures of output and so on and so forth. I don't want to glamorize and romanticize how the environment is much cleaner where I live, and as I suspect in many other places in the world, and so on and so forth. But I think what we need to begin to think about is how we improve the qualities of life of people, especially some of the most disadvantaged in society, in order to ensure that we are all, we come through this experience with our social solidarity greatly enhanced. And this, I think, is very important. The slogan of social distancing is actually very misleading. What is required is physical distancing. What is required are precautionary measures. Social distancing is the last thing we want. We want social solidarity to face this challenge together. And this can only come about through credible leadership, which basically is concerned about all of society. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jomo, and thank you particularly for ending your statement with this very, in a way, powerful and with making lots of sense, that the need is not a social distancing, but a physical distancing. And I must confess that it has not crossed my mind so far, but I think this is really something that is making lots of sense. As we mentioned before, I mean, I'd like to have my colleague Rebecca telling again how you can ask questions. I have already received many, many questions from all parts of the world, but we have about 40 to 45 minutes discussion of 40 minutes ahead of us, and let's make the best use of his time for engaging in a conversation. Rebecca, tell us again, please, the way to to organize this discussion.
Yes, of course. So if you would like to ask a question, you can type that to us in the chat function, and that goes straight to Jean-Christophe. He can read it. He will read it aloud for you. But please make sure that you let us know where you're from and your name and your affiliation. If you would like to ask your question verbally, then there is a function where you can virtually raise your hand. Again, that alerts me and Jean-Christophe that you're keen to ask a question. And if Jean-Christophe calls on you by name, then I can unmute your microphone so that you can be heard by everybody in the webinar. But that might take a couple of seconds, so please bear with me while we get your mic sorted, and try and keep your question to 30 seconds or less so we can have more discussion from our experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. So let's now start the conversation. And to be frank, I'm not sure exactly about who is raising their hands and who is asking a question live. So I would like to ask Edward McMahon, who is with the University of Vermont in the US. who sent two interesting questions. If he would like to ask his question live, or otherwise I will read them. So Rebecca, maybe if you can give access to Ned, that would be great.
Greetings, everybody. Jean-Christophe, maybe you can just raise your hand to confirm that you can hear me. Okay, thank you, thank you. Well, two quick questions to all of the panelists. First, thank you very much for this very, very useful set of perspectives. My first question is maybe a bit of a devil's advocate question, and that is, does the current crisis reflect any underlying fundamental economic global disequilibrium? If not, what does that tell us about the rapidity with which economic progress could be regenerated? My first question. Second question is, the Eastern model that you've discussed presupposes limits on civil and political rights. In many countries, this limits the ability of society to exercise control and transparency over the government, which can lead to higher corruption, less transparency, and have negative effects. The delay in China politicizing the virus is an example. We've also seen countries such as Hungary using the crisis as an excuse to limit civil and political rights. My question for you is this, these above observation, is it a valid critique of the Eastern model? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edward. So who wants to respond? Okay, order the three of you, very brief response so that we can take as many questions as possible.
Disequilibria are a feature of life. I think what we see here is that some systems were essentially better positioned to cope with this particular kind of challenge than others, and for the reasons that I gave earlier. Does this have to do with individual liberties under these circumstances? I'm a little skeptical of that because it's clear that in a wartime situation, what essentially this is the equivalent, the population pulls together and exercises a common purpose. And so a great many things become essentially secondary to that. In the Second World War, when my father was controlling prices, we had civilian boards who were responsible for monitoring the prices of every commodity that was in general consumption in the broad public. And that was not considered to be an infraction on civil liberties, but a necessary measure to pull the country through an emergency. So a great many things do have to be done. The ability of a country to do them is a function of how coherent its leadership is and how coherent its society is. Are there threats to civil liberties? Of course there are, and there are threats to democratic processes. And we saw this in the way the primary election was conducted in the state of Wisconsin a couple of days ago, in which a terrible travesty occurred. The entire city of Milwaukee had 5 polling places that were open because there weren't poll workers available. And so a great many people were disenfranchised. And that is something which could have been avoided by more effective organization, but more effective organization would have disadvantaged certain political interests. So we can see this problem emerging, how effectively it is possible to deal with it. We got through it World War II, and we got through other conflicts with still as a democracy. We can get through this as a democracy, but democracy has to be properly managed or people will lose faith in it.
Okay, Jomo?
Yes, thank you. I think I'll skip the first question and go straight to the second one. I think, as I suggested earlier, the East Asian experience is quite varied. And if we include Kerala as part of the Asian experience, I think there is far, far more democracy involved in how the Kerala government has responded and how the Kerala community has responded than found in any other society. I think it's also very important to recognize that in the case of Korea and other East Asian societies, civil liberties have been very much highly respected. You can have early action through and mobilization through a variety of means, including some of the means which Jamie Galbraith emphasized earlier in terms of the kind of mobilization in an extraordinary situation in this case, a war against a virus and its consequences. All this is possible. And as I emphasized in the case of China as well, there have been a variety of experiences. It's all too common that we hear about the Chinese this, the Chinese that, as if 1/4 of humanity, or maybe humanity, is all been subjected to similar conditions. I'm not suggesting, I'm not going to say anything more about China, but I think what has been done in Korea, what has been done in Kerala, give the lie to the claims that it is all involves draconian and repressive measures.
Thank you. Vladimir, very briefly.
Yes, I would start with the global economic disequilibriums. Probably you mean, the person who asked the question means that this is US current account deficit. US current account deficit is the biggest world economic disequilibrium. In this respect, I think that the recession will contribute to the elimination of this, not elimination, but to softening of these disequilibriums. Why? Because the recession in the US would be deeper than the recession in China. And naturally, recession leads to the reduction of imports more than to the reduction of exports. Exports may actually increase during the recession. So in this case, the US current account deficit will diminish, and maybe this will be good for the world economy. With respect to the second question, the human rights and the limitations on human freedoms, and authoritarian regimes, I would separate two things. Authoritarian regimes is one thing, and limitation of human rights is the other thing. The good example is one-child policy. Is it a limitation on human rights? Of course, it's limitation on reproductive rights. Is it good for economic growth? Yes, most economies agree that this is good for economic growth, and this is one of the reasons why China was developing so fast. In all the countries, say in European countries, there are limitations for the freedom of the press. Holocaust, denial of Holocaust would be a crime in many European countries. So the question is, how democratically the society can impose some reasonable restrictions on human rights, particular freedoms, particular human freedoms. And this is supposed to be decided democratically, and this is supposed to be for the common good. So it's the issue of collective interests versus the individual interests. And it is supposed to be discussed to what extent the requirements to proceed to the collective interest justify the reduction of the individual freedoms. Our individual freedoms are already reduced. We cannot cry in the crowded theater, fire, fire. It's well known. And in the press, we cannot advocate we cannot do the propaganda of racism, fascism, of racial hatred, and so on. So this is all for the common good. And once 95% of the society agrees that this should be a limitation, it should be a limitation. Thank you.
Thank you. I will I've asked three persons who asked for the floor. Actually, it's really fascinating, because we are in a way bombarded with questions from truly around the world. And I would like to ask Rebecca to give access to maybe just three of them. But before, I will convey a question from our partner Go News in India. But Rebecca, if you can prepare with René Fourlaurer, who is from Chile, then Beatriz Bicio, who is from Rio de Janeiro, and then Spiridon Gokkas from Greece. So, we are really trying to bring the different perspective. I would like first to ask you, that's the question from our partners from Go News in India. What will be the possible effect on global foreign investment of the crisis, taking into account that at this very moment in time, global or foreign investors have a tendency to look much more inwards than looking internationally. So, and of course, this has a tremendous impact, and it is not just coincidence. The question is coming from India. So what is, for a country like India or for many other developing countries, what is the likely impact of the crisis on foreign investment?
Well, at the moment, what you're seeing is a flight to safety, which means a flight to the government bills and bonds of the countries that are typically considered to be the most secure, including, interestingly enough, the United States, since despite the fact that we're have one of the less well-organized responses to the virus so far. Will that change? I think it will change, but only quite slowly over time. And I'm very much in the line of the view expressed by my Brazilian economist friend, Luis Carlos Bresser Pereira, that a country pursuing a development strategy should not be relying on external debt or external financial flows. Openness of trade. I suspect that trade will resume because the global supply chains will still be there, and they can be handled with the physical distancing required to keep them reasonably safe. But I suspect that the financial exposures will be considerably less going forward than they have been in the past.
Thank you. Maybe Rebecca, did you give access to our three guests? And I would like also, because we will have limited time, but also to ask Wei Zhang from China, who is asking a question about food security, also to get prepared to ask the question.
So I am just unmuting some people now, and they should be appearing. So perhaps if Beatrice would like to go first.
Okay. I will, with pleasure, put my question. And congratulations, it's a great discussion. I would like to know the role you expect from society itself. We have spoken about the role of the state, but we have seen that society is crucial, is a key actor in this pandemic. So as a professor at the university, I would like you to discuss the role of education of society to be prepared for such challenges, and particularly the self-organization of society of a key also. Do you think that's important? We have always been thinking about the state. I think with this experience, society itself is crucial.
Okay.
Do you agree?
Thank you very much. This is also a question that we can bring in the third seminar that will be really looking at the societal impact of the crisis. I suggest we take the next two questions from René Furchlorer, who is in Chile, Wei Wang in China, and Mr. Spirigon was in Greece.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for taking my question. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Oh, thanks a lot, and congratulations also because of this very interesting webinar. So my question was intended to Mr. Jomo as an expert in the Asian markets. Chile is very integrated with the Asian markets along the Pacific Basin. So we have been seeing with the biggest interest the development of China and its integration into this basin. But because our biggest commercial partner is China, and it's making very difficult to get politically integrated with these countries. They are intervening recently in our internal politics. So how this pandemic affect the integration of India into this Pacific basin? This is my question. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Wei Zhang. Can you unmute? Yep.
I'm having, you should be unmuted now.
Yep. Wei Zhang.
Sorry?
Yeah, go ahead. Ask your question.
Sorry, we're having a slight problem with Wei Zhang's microphone. If perhaps we could go to Spiridon first.
Okay, so Spiridon first, go ahead. All right, so maybe we will get back to them later on. We have already a few questions. So we have first a question from Go News about international foreign investment, and then we have the question from Chile and from Buenos Aires, from Rio de Janeiro, sorry.
Jomo, you want to take the Indian question?
Sure. I think it's all bets are off about the future trends in foreign direct investment. I think what is likely to happen is that as people move from one panicky situation to another, perceptions of one panic to another, as we are going to see a lot of movements on financial markets, on liquid financial markets especially. But how much that will contribute to the economic revival remains to be seen. I think foreign direct investment can be quite important, but it's not very clear how firms who are the main actors in any case are going to reorganize themselves, how governments are going to try to reorganize national economies. There will be a great deal of emphasis, for example, on trying to secure greater national food security. There might be more investments going into in that direction, and so on and so forth. So a country like the United States, which is the single largest agricultural exporter in the world, may find that it has less customers out there, except for China itself, because of the deal which has been made with China. A country like the Netherlands, which is the second largest agricultural exporter, may also be affected, and so on and so forth. I think it is too soon to tell. I think we have not had sufficient discussion about how the economic production and economic services are being disrupted by the not only by the lockdowns, but more importantly by the new normal. What is the new normal going to look like? How are different actors going to respond to situations? It is very likely that the global supply chains which have built up over the last 3 or 4 decades will be significantly impaired. It is also very likely that, given the challenges to multilateralism, which we have seen in the recent period, even before the COVID-19 lockdown, and the determination by some very influential powers to point fingers as to who is responsible for this crisis and so on, is going to further impair multilateral cooperation. And this will pose extremely important challenges. In this situation, dialogue of civilizations will be very important in terms of trying to maintain a second or third line of communication and dialogue among people who share common universal values in going forward, and how we can try to come through this to make sure that the new normal is in line with such values. But that's going to be easier said than done. There is very little interest in that right now, and I do not see this happening in the immediate future. But I think it's precisely these kinds of dialogues which DOC is organizing on today and in future and elsewhere, where we will be able to influence some of the conversations which are taking place. Thank you.
I'd like to make just 3 quick points in response to Beatrice's question and also to Wei Jiang's question, which is now visible in the chat box, and I can come to that. On the question of the role of society, I think there are a number of crucial elements. One of them has to do with the way the workers who are actually making the system function at this point, who are saving saving us in many ways, are treated. The people who are in the medical care system are under extreme stress, but the people who run the food supply chain are among the least well-treated workers in our societies. And people who are absolutely essential are people who man the checkout counters, the cashiers in grocery stores, the people who stock, the people who drive the food, the people who move things through the warehouses, the people who pick the vegetables and other crops in the fields. And we've got to recognize that the hierarchy with which we've treated these very essential people has been entirely inappropriate. It's certainly inappropriate to the current situation. They are now effectively frontline or just behind the frontline troops. And we have to reorganize the way they're treated. They have to have their health care taken care of. They have to be adequately protected on the job, and they have to be adequately paid. So that's a social reorganization that's going to have to come, or we're going to have these supply chains breaking on us both externally and internally. Second point is that that we are seeing, and we have to see, and we'll see if we're going to be successful here, a very great emergence of what is essentially self-organization in society, of social solidarity expressed at the level of the neighborhood, the community, the town, the city, the province. This is not all going to come from the national level. It can't. It has to be people thinking about their local situation, developing their own leadership. And we certainly see this in this country where the credible leadership has emerged at the local and the state level. And people do respond to it. They know who to respect and how to find respected people they can respect, and they're organizing, so far holding together in many cases in their neighborhoods in spite of stresses that they haven't experienced. And I'm sure that's going on all the way around the world. It was certainly highly visible in China, and was no question about that. For my household, we watched that situation very, very closely because part of my family is Chinese and lives in China. So it's something that we all saw. It was extremely impressive, and I'm sure everybody has this experience in their own communities. And the third point I'd make is about the global exchange, which is, yes, and this response to Wei Jiang, who said that his question dealt with the fact that some countries are restricting food exports and pharmaceutical exports and so forth. To a degree, it's understandable, but it's also regrettable. I believe that it's the case that in the early part of the pandemic in China, a fair amount of medical protective equipment actually flew from the United States to China. Some of it was sourced locally, and some of it was actually provided, I believe, by the government. And in the current situation where the Chinese have got their situation under control and we've been deeply stressed, supplies have been coming in. They've been coming in. I saw the mayor of Los Angeles thanking the city of Shanghai. Supplies flew in to New York from China. And we saw a very moving scene a few days ago when an Antonov 124 came in from Russia, full of quality medical supplies for New Yorkers. Air traffic controller at JFK Airport was giving in a very professional tone and very briefly what was clearly a profound gratitude. So the mutual self-help in this situation is clearly the way to go at the global level as well as at the local level.
Thank you. Vladimir, would you like to add one word, or can we switch to the next question?
Yes, maybe just one word. Okay. On the issue of foreign direct investment, I hope you can see the chart that I was trying to put on the screen for everyone. This is the stock of foreign direct investment as a percentage of global GDP. And on this chart, you can see that the ratio of the foreign direct investment to global GDP increased dramatically from 5% 100 years ago to 35% today. There may be ups and downs, but I would say that this trend will continue. Why? Because it's associated with greater productivity. The difference would be that this would be Chinese investment. Now we see Chinese investment in Africa, but we'll see Chinese investment all over the place. And there was a question in French. I was watching the chat that was going on, and the person, I think it's Monsieur the Text, if I pronounce the name correctly, the question was that China probably is going to be #1 economic power, and I bet that the discussants will not have the time to answer this question. Well, I tried to answer this question on the chat, saying that China is already #1 economic power. If you check the statistics, PPP GDP 5 years ago exceeded Chinese GDP. Purchasing power parity GDP exceeded the American GDP. China is becoming #1, or is already a #1 economic power. And now trade, the share of trade of virtually every country in the world, who is the major trading partner? Now it's more and more countries is China, China, China. So we're going to see, because China is developing so fast, that I think this development will continue, even though there is a slowdown, which occurred even before coronavirus recession. Thank you. Thank
you, Vladimir. I would just correct the name. This is actually Mr. Alain Destex, from Belgium, and who has been during more than 20 years a very prominent member of the parliament in Belgium. So thanks to have you. It's good to have you, Alain, connected today. So we are now close to the end of this discussion. And in a way, it's really amazing to see, when I said in my introduction that our goal is really to generate a global conversation. This is really a very clear illustration of the capacity of the Dialogue of Civilization Institute to organize such a a global conversation from many multiple perspectives. We have got also, I mean, we have plenty of other questions. I'm very sorry for everyone, for not being able to pick them up. But this will be also put on the website, so we can certainly find different ways, to pursue the discussion. There is one very sensitive question also about the sort of the collapse of the oil price, and what does it mean? What are the possible prospects and consequences of this? This is of course something very important. And getting back to the question about the role of the states, there are actually a few questions to ask. If you consider that the reaction of the states today is much stronger or more effective today than it was 12 years ago with the financial crisis. So have we learned something from the financial crisis, and governments and states, are they better equipped and placed to respond to the crisis? And so if you don't mind, we will end up with those questions and then turn to Dr. Yakunin, who will give concluding remarks.
Well, I'll come in on the question of the financial crisis. I believe many wrong lessons were learned. The financial crisis was followed by a pivot to austerity in the United States and by a deep austerity in the Mediterranean countries of Europe. It was oriented towards saving the large institutions and not towards saving homeowners in the United States, not towards saving the health system of, let's say, the countries of Greece or Italy. And the stresses that followed over the subsequent 10 years exposed countries, including our own, to the extraordinary dangers that we're facing now. If we follow the same playbook this time, and to a degree we are, simply as a matter of habit, if we don't learn to adapt to the problem that we have, we're going to face afterwards a terrible conflict between subsidiary units of governments, nations in Europe and states and localities in the United States, who won't have the revenues to provide the services that are absolutely essential. We have to overcome that by essentially making sure that everything is provided for that is required, and that things are reorganized so that we have a viable society. If we don't do that, we're going to have a wave of dispossessions and continuing weakening of essential services, and we'll be more vulnerable the next time than we are. I'm hopeful that we will come to our senses and develop an effective plan, but it's not entirely sure. And there are people who are anxious, as they were after the European crisis and after the American crisis, to scoop up the distressed assets and to buy out the defaulted debts and to try and make a killing on this. And that will be the conflict going forward, and it has to be addressed and it has to be forestalled. And we have to go to essentially a post-war situation such as in World War II, not such as in World War I. After World War II, the inter-Allied debts were forgiven, the German debts were eventually written down, and we had a successful 30 years of prosperity following it. That's the model to follow, and it has to be followed internally as well as externally in the wake of this disaster. Thank you.
Jomo?
Yes, thank you. Let me try to address René's question. It really deals with the larger question of cross-border economic relations. I think the age of trade globalization, if you can call it that, basically ended about slightly over a decade ago, at the time of the great financial crisis and the recession which followed. We saw a significant reduction in the growth of world trade, and it has never really recovered for more than a decade now. But however, I think what we can call loosely financial liberalization, and some aspects are quite different from other aspects, has continued in the period since then. And the phenomena are very, very uneven in different parts of the world because there is no international financial authority. The IMF is not an international financial authority. The Bank of International Settlements has got jurisdiction only in a limited range of areas. And so what we see is that, for example, the phenomenon of share buybacks in the United States has not been generalized to much of the rest of the world. So what is important, therefore, is to recognize that this elephant, which we call globalization, and as we approach and this elephant, like the proverbial blind man, and touch the different parts of the elephant. Actually, we are talking, when we use big terms like globalization, we're actually referring to very, very different phenomena. And so my expectation is actually that that international economic relations, both of the real economy, namely trade, as well as real greenfield foreign direct investment, because many of the figures which my good friend Vladimir Popov referred to actually consist of what are called brownfield foreign direct investment. In other words, mergers and acquisitions, and is usually acquisitions as far as emerging market economies are concerned. So taking over an existing economic capacity really does not enhance economic capacity in any significant fashion. So I'm not quite sure, as I suggested earlier, how firms are going to reorganize, including firms in major economies such as China, India, and so on, and also firms in the US, how they will reorganize themselves, how they will organize their supply chains, how they will cater to their customers nationally as well as internationally. All that is really uncertain territory, and I'm not prepared to make any speculation at this point. But I think what is important, if I may conclude on this note, is this time it is really different. And we cannot talk about business as usual or reverting to business as usual, whether it's globalization or anything else, but rather we have to begin to think about the process by which we come about developing the new rules of the game. In a sense, we have the opportunity of the Second World War. President Roosevelt was able to make a lasting impression on the world economy, precisely because some of the initiatives which were undertaken in the United States and also internationally before his death. And we think about the Bretton Woods institutions and so on, that heritage we live with. How the world gets its act together after this is going to be defining, I suspect, for a generation to come, and if not longer. And this, I think, is extremely important. And this is precisely why these types of conversations, these types of dialogues are so important for us to begin to promote and try to develop some kind of consensus around what we, the people, really want. Thank you.
Thank you, Jomo. Vladimir Popov.
Yes, thank you, Jean-Christophe. Just a couple of words about the role of the state in the future. I think most economists agree that there may be cases of government failure, there may be cases of market failure, and the future economy should combine markets and governments in an optimal way. Now, what is the optimal way? In times of the crisis, it turns out that the market economy is not very efficient. If you look at the experience of market economies during the war, you have the example. I hope you can see this chart that I'm trying to show you, the slide. You have the examples of market economies using the state with a great success. I checked the statistics. I know Professor Galbraith knows much more about it. He has written about it more than once. But the statistics is that the annual increase in GDP in the United States during the war in 1941-43 was 16 to 20%. Never before and never after the American economy was growing at such high rates as during the first years of the Second World War. And this was due to the government programs to reallocate resources from the non-defense industries to defense industries. And even better results were exhibited by centrally planned economies during the war, by the economy of the former Soviet Union. These economies, centrally planned economies, are inefficient. I wrote a lot about inefficiencies of centrally planned economies, but they have at least one advantage. They can mobilize savings and resources, and they can mobilize savings for investment, and they can reallocate investment and capital and labor very rapidly from one industry to another. To give you one example, in 1940, Germany was producing 2 times more steel than the Soviet Union. In 3 years, the Soviet Union was producing more tanks, aircrafts, and artillery guns than Germany. And this was the reason why the Soviet Union won the war. So if we use this experience today, we would be able to cope with the recession. I think it was Professor Galbraith who said that this recession, this coronavirus problem is not really a problem if you act appropriately. And I would very much subscribe to this view.
Thank you, Vladimir. It's now unfortunately time to come to an end, and I keep on receiving lots of questions, and really I want to apologize, not being able to take on all those questions. I'd like just to mention one that I think would be a very nice. We will not respond to it now, but it would be a very nice transition to the second webinar that we are organizing in this series, which is a question from Spiridon Bazinas, whose question is about whether globalization will be strengthened based on the argument that nation states cannot fully address global challenges on their own. And I think it's a very interesting question about what is the future of multilateralism, which is at the very heart of the agenda and the priority of DOC. Of course, we will have the opportunity to address this question in the next seminar, and I invite everyone who is connected today to register for the second seminar, which will be on Tuesday, April 21st, and that will be looking more specifically at the geopolitical consequences and impact of the pandemic. We will have, as of today, 3 guest speakers. We will have Shada Islam, who is the head of geopolitics at the Friends of Europe in Brussels. We will have Suresh Prabhu, who is the Sherpa of the Prime Minister for the G20 in India, and Dr. Wong, who is a member of the board of the Dialogue of Civilization Institute and also the CEO of the Center for China and Globalization. So again, we will have a global conversation with China, India, and Europe, looking at the possible geopolitical consequences of the coronavirus. So now I would like to turn, and maybe a last word also to tell our speakers that you have been really doing an outstanding job. And I'd like also to thank particularly also my team, my colleagues, Rebecca, who you have seen, and also a team who have been really working around the clock in the past few days to make this webinar happening in such very good condition. And this is in a way a new avenue for DOC to engage on a regular basis through those webinars. So I'm I have the pleasure now to turn to Dr. Yakunin, who is with us and who is the chairman of the Dialogue of Civilization Institute, but also the founder, and who will give his concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Jean-Christophe, distinguished speakers. Thank you very much for your very profound interaction in terms of this first webinar. And I have not very much to say because, I'm restricted by the timing. What I would like to point out, firstly, Jomo, thank you very much. As a long-standing member of the Dialogue family, you mentioned dialogue several times, and I suppose you're absolutely correct. This is very essential now to deal with this coronavirus crisis in terms of equal dialogue between different societies and different countries. But speaking about the substance of this discussion, because I am not economist, excuse me if I am wrong, but I am doing research in political sciences, and maybe more my approach reflects so-called political economic approach. And though, Professor Popov, at the beginning of his remarks, he was trying to introduce pure economic, consequences of this virus crisis. In the course of our discussion, everyone inevitably was dealing with other aspects of the social life. And this is exactly the method of the dialogue of civilization paradigm methodology, because we are trying to consider all the events and developments inside human society through the prism of economic, political, social, civilizational, cultural aspects. And that is correct. To my mind, I suppose we were very closely considering the consequences, but we stand a little bit before accepting that actual model of today's economy is not able to deal with the crisis. This was said by you. And that is posing another question. If the existing model, which we still call capitalism, is actually sustainable in terms of dealing with such kind of new crisis, which we possibly in contemporary world have not seen before. And this is not that I can accept the statement that there is, I completely agree with Professor Galbraith, there is no some specific Asian model. It is the same model with some cultural differences in terms of introduction this model into reality. On the other hand, Professor Popov raised a very interesting question, which I suppose also is of very serious substance, a restriction of the human rights. We were talking about, discipline, we were talking about solidarity, but in the political science, we call our existing society as atomization society. And therefore, again, there is a huge field for activity of the society itself. Because, if we are talking about, as Professor Popov just mentioned, some kind of equilibrium of state involvement and the pure market economy, I don't actually can consider we have any basis, to see how it can work. Will it be a restructuring of the model or introduction of some actually alternative models? I'm not ready to say, but I suppose it is extremely interesting point of view. We should not use ostrich methodology, trying to stop before the actually naming those problems we are facing now. And this is not the better model for China or better introduction of the concentration of the resources on the part of Russia or something being completely wrong with the United States politics. It is not correct. Everyone is trying to survive as the one can see it. And here, exactly, we are coming to the necessity of dialogue and solidarity, not only inside the society, but solidarity between countries. And that is possibly the next point to be discussed at the next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yakunin, for those concluding remarks. And we are indeed very excited to have this second conversation in just a few days. I want again to thank everyone for taking part in this discussion. I've seen that from the very start, we had a very stable turnout, which was more than 100 participants throughout the whole seminar or webinar, which I think is a very positive for a first time. And we had very good speakers, very good discussion. Again, I want really to thank my colleagues who have been doing really an amazing job working around the clock to make sure this could happen. There are lots of IT also components to make sure that everything goes well. And thanks a lot. Keep on sending, if you like, messages. If you want to engage with Dialogue of Civilization Institute, let us know. you know, because many people are really truly coming from around the world, and we would certainly like to continue the conversation. We see you on the 21st for the second seminar. Thanks again to our speakers who have been doing a fantastic job, and thanks to everyone for taking part. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.